proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Banking Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-418 and the Senate proceed to its consideration.
Clerk will report.
S-418, a bill to award a Congressional Gold Medal to the World War II members of the Civil Air Patrol.
Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be read a third time and passed, the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and any statements related to the bill be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I want to speak about S-418 that we just passed. I want to thank all my colleagues for allowing this to go through on a unanimous consent basis. This is a bill to award a Congressional Gold Medal to the World War II members of the Civil Air Patrol. I introduced this legislation last year, and it currently has 85 co-sponsors. Now, this legislation will offer long overdue recognition to a small group of people who answered the call to duty at our nation's time of maximum danger. 70 years ago, during the height of World War II, Civil Air Patrol members in small aircraft began searching for German U-boats off of the Atlantic coast. This was a time of great peril for the nation, when over 400 ships were sunk in U.S. waters, many in view of Americans on the shore. And the military did not have enough aircraft and ships to stop this carnage. That's why the Civil Air Patrol answered the call. Their mission was highly unusual because these pilots were civilian volunteers flying their own airplanes on combat operations, often at their own expense. The mission was for Civil Air Patrol aircraft to force the U-boats below the surface of the water, making their attacks on shipping much more difficult and time-consuming. As soon as the Civil Air Patrol pilots took to the air, they spotted so many U-boats that the military quickly armed their aircraft with small bombs and depth charges. From Maine to Texas, Civil Air Patrol aircraft flew these missions in pairs up to 100 miles offshore in all seasons, often in bad weather. These CAP pilots, as they're known, put themselves at great risk, flying over water at low levels with only a compass, one radio, minimal survival gear to help them if they got in trouble. Many pilots had to ditch in the water. 26 pilots lost their lives and 90 aircraft were lost. During an 18-month period, the Civil Air Patrol flew over 24 million miles on its anti-submarine coastal patrols. It spotted 173 U-boats, attacked 57, sank or damaged 2. It also escorted over 5,600 convoys, reported 17 floating mines, 36 bodies, 91 ships in distress, and 363 survivors in the water. Most importantly, CAP's constant presence over the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico was a major factor in pushing enemy operations away from the coast and protecting vital shipping and cargo up and down our coastlines. In 1943, German U-boat attacks ceased off the Atlantic coast of the United States. One high-level German officer credited Civil Air Patrol with being the primary reason for withdrawal, saying, quote, "It was because of those blank little red and yellow airplanes," end quote. As the U-boat threat ended, Civil Air Patrol expanded its homeland security and emergency operations to include search and rescue, border patrol, forest fire patrol, disaster relief in every state in the nation. By war's end, nearly 60,000 members had participated in Civil Air Patrol, flew 75 million miles, over 750,000 hours in support of critical home front missions. Its volunteers ranged in age from 18 to over 80. Many served for the entire war, while others, most of whom later joined the military, served for shorter periods. A substantial number received belligerent certificates indicating they had participated in combat-related operations on active duty with the Civil Air Patrol. The individual accounts of Civil Air Patrol pilots' performance and heroism are too numerous to recount, but just a few examples can illustrate the valor with which they served. For instance, Major Hugh Sharp and Lieutenant Eddie Edwards from Rehoboth, Delaware, landed their Sikorsky amphibian in high seas to rescue two other CAP airmen who had to ditch their plane. They found one crew member who was badly hurt, but they were unable to take off due to a pontoon damage during rough landing in 10-foot seas. They made a decision to taxi the aircraft back to land, but they quickly discovered that the damaged amphibian listed too far to the left, and it didn't make much progress. It just sort of went around circles. So Eddie volunteered to climb out to the end of the right wing to keep the plane in balance. The next day, when a Coast Guard ship met the aircraft, Eddie had to be carried from the wing after holding on tightly for 11 hours in freezing and wet conditions. Both pilots were awarded the first Air Medals of the war by President Roosevelt. Captain Francis Mac McLaughlin flew coastal patrol missions from Daytona Beach, Florida for 17 months. During that time, he, along with Albert Crabtree, ditched a Fairchild 24 aircraft in the Atlantic and floated in a life raft for several hours until the Coast Guard picked them up. They quickly became members of the, quote, Duck Club, end quote, an exclusive organization that recognized those who survived a CAP ditching. There would soon be many in that club, as I mentioned. When the Coastal Patrol ended, Mac went to Massachusetts to tow aerial targets, CAP's second most dangerous duty after the Coastal Patrol. 7 CAP pilots and observers would be shot down and killed during gunnery practice. Mac, who served the entire war on active duty with the Civil Air Patrol, just passed away at the end of 2011. Another CAP veteran was Lieutenant Charles Compton, who flew from Coastal Patrol Base 1 at Atlantic City, New Jersey, on anti-submarine and convoy escort missions. He recently noted that, quote, convoys could be attacked at any time. We had a war going on and the threat of German submarines off the East Coast. Our job was to make it less easy for the German submarines to surface without being detected. Charles, who lives near Chicago, turned 95 last summer, remembers that during these dangerous missions, pilots often use sunken ships as points of reference to help them navigate over open water. He added that, unfortunately, sunken ships were plentiful at that time. Recently recognized for his service with Civil Air Patrol's Distinguished Service Award, he credits the exceptional efforts of his fellow Atlantic City Squadron members for the honor he received. Well, these are just 3 stories, but they're illustrative of Civil Air Patrol's many World War II heroes. More importantly, these stories serve as a powerful reminder of the dedication and service that all gave to our nation. When the war ended, Civil Air Patrol members received the recognition they deserved. Their story over time, however, was lost to much of the nation. This Congressional Gold Medal will ensure that this story is told over and over again for future generations and recognize the Civil Air Patrol and its World War II members for their critically important service to our nation. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
continues here in the Senate on renewing the Export-Import Bank's charter. Off the floor, leaders are trying to figure out what amendments, if any, would be allowed to the bill. That legislation passed in the House earlier this week by a vote of 330 to 93. Russia's ambassador to the U.S. is speaking right now at an event on U.S.-Russia relations on the eve of the G8 summit. The summit is being held May 18th and 19th. It was supposed to be President Putin's first foreign trip since he returned to the Kremlin. But Reuters writes that instead, Mr. Putin is sending Prime Minister Medvedev and a message that as long as he's in charge, Russia will not bend to Washington's will when its interests are at stake. You can see live coverage of that event from the Center for Strategic and International Studies right now on C-SPAN 3. We're waiting for a senator to speak. The National Journal writes that the House Armed Services Committee tucked a measure in the Defense Programs Bill yesterday that bans marriage or marriage-like ceremonies on military bases for same-sex couples. That move came hours after President Obama said he supports same-sex marriage in an interview with ABC News. Aside from two anti-gay amendments, the bill rejects Pentagon budget cuts and adds funds for an unrequested East Coast missile defense system that opponents warn could cost $5 billion. That in the National Journal. After the Senate is out in primetime tonight, we'll have a Senate Armed Services Subcommittee hearing on military readiness, including representatives of the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Forces. That'll be here on C-SPAN 2 tonight at 8 Eastern if the Senate is out. President Obama is attending a couple of campaign fundraisers today, one in Seattle and another one in Los Angeles. The Washington Post writes that President Obama's widely publicized fundraiser with actor George Clooney is shaping up to be a Hollywood blockbuster. The dinner at Clooney's Studio City, California home has sold out at 150 guests who are expected to jointly contribute between $5 million and $6 million towards President Obama's re-election effort. In addition, The Hollywood Reporter cites sources that say that the campaign expects to have raised as much as $6 million more in online donations, which were solicited as part of a nationwide contest to win a ticket to the dinner. The Washington Post goes on to say a haul of $12 million would arguably make the soiree the biggest single presidential fundraising event in U.S. history.
President,
Senator from Rhode Island.
we are presently in a quorum call.
We are.
May I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted?
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm here to close the Senate for the day. But before I do that, I wanted to speak for a moment about the ongoing and deliberately overlooked problem of carbon pollution and what it is doing to our planet. And in the context of these remarks, I want to first ask unanimous consent to put into the record an article entitled "Game Over for the Climate," written by Jim Hansen and published in yesterday's New York Times.
Without objection.
What this article says, it begins with two simple sentences. Global warming isn't a prediction, it is happening. He talks about the dangers of the Canada tar sands and what that means for us if we go ahead with that project. His conclusion is this: if Canada proceeds and we do nothing, it will be game over for the climate. Canada's tar sands, deposits of sand saturated with bitumen, contain twice the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by global oil use in our entire history. More carbon dioxide in those tar sands than emitted by global oil use in our entire history. He looks at the recent extreme weather that people not only across the country but across the world have been noticing and concludes, we can say with high confidence that the recent heat waves in Texas and Russia and the one in Europe in 2003, which killed tens of thousands, were not natural events. They were caused by human-induced climate change. So the risk that we face is a real one, and we're actually seeing it begin to happen in present time. The tar sands that he talks about, he says, contain enough carbon, 240 gigatons, to add 120 parts per million to our atmosphere. As I've said before on the Senate floor, we've lived for 8,000 centuries within a range between 170 and 300 parts per million of carbon in our atmosphere. That's the bandwidth within which the human species has lived on this planet. And we have gone rocketing out of that bandwidth in recent years. We're now at 390 parts per million, out of a bandwidth for 800,000 years between 170 and 300 parts per million. The tar sands would add 120 parts per million to that. That would take us to 510, if my math is right. Tar shale, a close cousin of tar sands found mainly in the United States, contains at least an additional 300 gigatons of carbon. And this really shows what Dr. Hansen describes as, it really shows the folly of what he describes as a frantic stampede we're now engaged in to extract every fossil fuel through mountaintop removal, longwall mining, hydraulic fracturing, tar sands and tar shale extraction, and deep ocean and Arctic drilling. Jim Hansen is somebody who is worth listening to. He has been writing about this now for more than 30 years. And I would like to also add to the record, as a part of these remarks, a posting by Neil Wagner entitled "Hansen Had It Right in 1981 Climate Report." He says, a recently rediscovered 1981 paper written by NASA atmospheric physicist James Hansen and others has been analyzed and found to be impressively accurate about the course of climate change since its publication. The 10-page paper, which was published in the journal Science, had been overlooked for decades when researchers Geert-Jan van Oldenburg and Rein Harsma from the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute uncovered it and began scouring its contents. The paper's impressive prognostication is the best kind of vindication for Hansen, who has suffered more than his share of the slings and arrows from climate deniers in the media. The complex world of climate science, he concludes, rarely enjoys such clear and simple validation. When such an opportunity presents itself, we owe it to ourselves to make some noise about it. So, with appreciation to Jim Hansen for how the actual science has borne him out over the past 30 years, and with respect for the predictions that he makes, we should, as soon as we can, begin to address ourselves to this problem. Jim is not alone in this. An array of scientific organizations wrote us all a letter back in October of 2009, whose conclusion is pretty clear and stark in scientific language. Observations throughout the world make it clear that climate change is occurring, and rigorous scientific research demonstrates that the greenhouse gases emitted by human activities are the primary driver. These conclusions are based on multiple independent lines of evidence, and contrary assertions are inconsistent with an objective assessment of the vast body of peer-reviewed science. We act as if it's something new, but in fact, it's not. The determination that carbon dioxide would warm the planet as it increased its concentration in the atmosphere was figured out around the time of the American Civil War by an Irish scientist who worked in England named John Tyndall. And what Tyndall discovered, we have proven to be true, as since then we have dumped gigaton after gigaton of carbon into our atmosphere, loading it up to the point where we are now, as I said before, well outside the bounds that have protected our species for 800,000 years on this planet. The scale of what 8,000 centuries means is perhaps best measured against the time that we scientists now believe mankind first began to engage in agriculture, first started scratching at the earth and putting seeds in the ground. Before then, we were primarily hunter-gatherers, leading a very primitive life. So we've gone from beginning to scratch at the earth and plant things to the human species that we are today in 10,000 years. We have lived within this bandwidth of 170 to 300 parts per million for 8,000 centuries. And to veer outside of it is a significant and hazardous thing. And I'm delighted that Mr. Hansen, despite all the abuse that has been heaped on him, continues his work on this. And I hope that the time comes when we start to listen to the voice of what our planet is telling us, the voice of what our scientists are telling us, the voice of what our children are telling us, and not just the voice of what the lobbyists for the polluting industries, particularly the oil and gas industries, are telling us. Because frankly, the lobbyists for the polluting oil and gas industries are not telling us the truth. They are not telling us the truth. The truth is becoming increasingly apparent, and the problem is that as time goes by, you can reach tipping points that are irrecoverable. And it would be really tragic for us to look back and think that if we'd been able to act on time, if we'd listened to the signals of our Earth and planet, the signals that are plain in our face, on time, we could have made a world that was better and safer for our children. But instead, in our folly, in our greed, in our willingness to listen to the falsehoods of these polluters, we shot past that point and there's no way to recover it now. So with that said, let me turn to the closing business of the Senate today and ask unanimous consent that we proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Unanimous consent that the Senate now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 4967, which was received from the House and is at the desk.
Clerk will report.
H.R. 4967, an act to prevent the termination of the temporary office of bankruptcy judges in certain judicial districts.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed with the measure.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be read 3 times and passed, the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and any statements related to the bill be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I now ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to Senate Resolution 456, submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 456, commemorating and acknowledging the dedication and sacrifice made by the federal, state, and local law enforcement officers who have been killed or injured in the line of duty.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
And I'll just take a moment to recognize the significance of that measure. I know the presiding officer in his many years as Attorney General of the state of Connecticut became keenly aware of the sacrifice that our law enforcement officers are too often called upon to make to protect our community. In the state of Rhode Island, we've recently lost a Providence police officer killed in the line of duty, and so it is a somber and important act that we take, and I ask unanimous consent that this resolution be agreed to, that the preamble be agreed to, that the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and any statements be placed in the record as if read.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate now proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 458, which was submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 458, commemorating May 15, 2012, as the sesquicentennial of the founding of the Department of Agriculture.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I'll ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, that the preamble also be agreed to, and that the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I'll now ask unanimous consent that on Monday, May 14, 2012, at 4:30 p.m., the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations, calendar numbers 570 and 571. That there be 60 minutes for debate equally divided in the usual form, but upon the use or yielding back of time, the Senate proceed to vote without intervening action or debate on the nominations in the order listed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order, that any related statements be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and that the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection.
Finally, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, the Senate adjourn until 2:00 p.m. on Monday, May 14th, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, and the time for the 2 leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and that the majority leader be recognized. Further, that when the Senate resumes legislative session following the votes on the Russell and Tharp nominations, the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture, on the motion to proceed to H.R. 2072.
Without objection.
I am informed that it is the majority leader's intention to resume consideration of the motion to proceed to H.R. 2072, the Export-Import Bank Reauthorization Bill, on Monday. At 4:30 p.m., there will be an hour of debate on the Russell and Tharp nominations. At 5:30 p.m., there will be up to 3 roll call votes on confirmation of the Russell nomination, confirmation of the Tharp nomination, and on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to H.R. 2072, the Export-Import Bank Bill. If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it now adjourn under the previous order.
Thank you. The Senate stands adjourned until 2 p.m. on Monday, May 14th.